from the US, and someone must have been talking about the drought tolerance of sorghum Sudan grass. And when you have to remember, when you're talking about Illinois and they're growing and a crop and they're talking about drought, if they're talking about 10 inches of rain, in their mind, that's a drought. So when we start talking about Bismarck, okay, so now when Jay is talking about drought tolerance, that's going to be a lot closer than what we're going to be talking about drought. Then if we go over to Swift Current, okay, maybe they're going to be even drier yet. So yeah, here's some really good charts that are coming up. So, you know, if you're looking at a grazing situation, you know, fall rye, it has a definite place for drought tolerance. Teff grass is a grass where they grow in Ethiopia. So if teff grass, if it's too dry to grow teff grass, that means you're drier. So now it says my internet is unstable, so if you lose me, I'm sorry. But you know, the first question has to be, what is the goal?
So another question that's come in is, I have a 455 JD disc drill. I'm most worried about trying cover crops is finding out the seed lot go through the drill rollers. How should I approach my choices from my drill limitations with seed size?
Good question, because once again, this is the logistics part. So when we have, I'm not familiar with the 455, but basically what we're going to, you know, looking at, you know, for the seed lots, if we're dealing with, say, what I'd call a fine roller and a roller situation. So now when we're putting the logistics together for that, what we want to do is know what our seed size is. And that's, you know, that's one of the reasons why I put that spreadsheet together. And if you want to go to the next level, here's a plug for my book. I wrote a book called Cover Cropping in Western Canada. And in that, it goes through the seeds, the average seeds per pound, and then the seeds per square foot. So when we're doing this blend, and you're dealing with say with these fine rollers that you have it either set for canola or you set it for small grains, what you're going to want to do is have similar seed sizes. So you don't want to have teff grass, which is 1.4 million seeds per pound, and having corn or faba beans. That is, you know, those are the logistics. So if you're dealing with fine rollers, now we have to go back to having similar seed size in that blend. So we may have to have, you know, 2 or 3 different blends you're seeding down at the same time, just so we can categorize the seed size properly.
Okay, so the next question is, which crops would you suggest to add to canola to add diversity, address compaction, and get some fall grazing?
That's a good one, because when you look at canola, canola has, in my mind, it challenges our soils the hardest. Number one, it is a brassica, so it's a scavenger. It's non-mycorrhizal. It responds really well to adding to fertilizer. So guess what? We keep adding a lot of fertilizer to these. And when we start adding fertilizer, if you listen to people like Dr. Nichols, one thing she talks about is when we have high fertilizer rates, what we're doing is we're outsourcing the microbes jobs. And so it really, you know, drives our soil health the wrong direction. So when we have canola and we want to get some fall grazing out of it, and we want to add diversity. So when we take a look at that triangle, so we have our grasses, our legumes, and our broadleaf. So canola is a broadleaf. What we want to do is now see if we can add a legume and add a grass to it. And so if we're going to be dealing with a clear field system, we can put something like subterranean clover or Persian clover in with that canola and seed it all at the same time. Because with Odyssey and Solo, you can spray the clovers and they're going to be safe. Now the grasses, it'll smoke unless you go with Solo, which doesn't have the grassy component. But basically, especially when you have good moisture, when you're done spraying, then you'd go and broadcast, 2/3 to 1.5 pounds of something like Italian ryegrass, which is a biennial with poor winter hardiness. So that'll stay green right up until the snow flies, and then it basically winter kills. So when I'm looking at that triangle, I would say the broadleaf in your canola, check. You go over to your Persian clover, subterranean clover. So there's your legume. And then with your grass, then you can put in your Italian ryegrass. Once again, there's another option of putting in the fall rye into a broadcast of fall rye or winter wheat or winter triticale. But you have to remember, those will overwinter. So now you're going to have to deal with them next spring. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what your goals are?
Okay. How would you deal with a field that is heavily established with quackgrass that you would want to plant a cover crop in to turn yearlings out on grass finishing and then terminating with cow-calf pairs in late fall, early winter?
There we go. Now the goals are getting a lot more specific. Awesome. So there's a really good book by J.L. McCammon, and it is called When Weeds Talk. Really good book. And so when we are looking at something like quackgrass, anything with a rhizomatous grass root, what it's doing is it's searching for calcium. So in that land, it tells me that your calcium availability, your calcium flux is low. So to get at the quackgrass, and once again, how thick is it? So if it's really thick and really competitive, that's going to be an issue. So we're going to have some way of knocking that back. So and this is one of the things when you listen to someone like Nicole Masters, she says that not all tillage is bad. So being able to go in and maybe do some tillage, go in with some, if you're not organic, maybe some glyphosate in the spring, which is not going to kill it, it's going to set it back. Maybe that's other things, strategies you have to do to knock it back, to then go in and seed, get some tuber crops in there, because to bring up more calcium is in the cell walls of plants. And so when you have these big tubers, that's going to be a lot of cell walls. So it brings up a lot of calcium. When that tuber rots, it gives off calcium, and that will help not suppress, but supply that calcium that quackgrass is looking for. So then the quackgrass will weaken because it's lost its ecological advantage over the other crops. So that would be one of the ways. The other option is, once again, allelopathy. This is where allelopathy could be your friend. So seeding a blend heavy with fall rye has a really good shot of helping suppress that quackgrass. So now allelopathy has gone from a potential enemy, it's going to go to your friend. Now we're going to have to, in my mind, the easiest way of getting stuff established consistently with fall rye is seed the rest of your cover crop first, let it get established, let that root get below the area that fall rye is going to release allelopathy into that soil, and then apply that fall rye after. So that would be a strategy you can use.
Okay, is there an ideal cover crop for reclaiming a very abused and depleted field with lots of topsoil loss? It's in a gray lubosolic area with loamy soils and some sand.
Ooh, yeah, that's going to be more of a challenge. And when you look at something like that, the first question is how bad is it? And the between the soil loss and this is maybe a real good spot where grabbing a soil sample, sending it down to Oyen, and getting the Chinook Applied Research Soil Health Lab to look at it, or if it's scary, if it really scares you, once again, in Western Canada, I only know a couple of soil regenerative coaches out there, and Daryl Chubb is one of them. And so, he loves challenges. Daryl, did you want to unmute and dive into this one a little bit?
You might have a hard time. I have to figure out how to unmute
Oh,
him.
okay. But yeah, it's, if it's that bad, we have to have some measurement of some sort to figure out where you're at. And the whole thing with cover crops and it's one tool of regenerating soils. So if we're just talking about so it's hard soil, low quality, low productivity, and eroded, well, maybe all we have to do is get a bunch of legumes in there, get some forbs, and get some different grasses in there to get the biology woken up.
I think Daryl
Yeah, that's
chime in now as well. If you'd like.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Very good.
Yep.
Nothing. Thanks for throwing me on the spot there, Kevin. So I guess
no problem, buddy.
my thought that comes to mind would be, I guess it doesn't matter where you are or what kind of soil. Probably the limiting factor is functional carbon, especially if it's eroded or that's what's coming to mind. So high carbon input, season long covers could be one way that I look towards.
Yeah, the functional group or functional plant groups, diversity, that living root. We have to breathe. We have to start breathing life into these soils, and exactly the carbon is one of the issues, or lack of it, functional.
So then Italian ryegrass could be a really good one, especially further north in that country. Oats are another really good one. And yeah, I guess like you've said through the whole presentation, is what's the goal and what's the purpose? And for me, diversity is key.
So would maybe putting some Phacelia out there just to increase the glomalin, just to hold the soil together a bit, would help, or no?
Absolutely. Chicory, plantain, and Phacelia are the forbs that we found are cost effective that we can get. And each one of those, because you're dealing with now forbs, it just opens up basically a new world of soil biology.
And for me, those are givens in just about every blend, whether it's grazing or more of a season-long cover or whatever you're doing. And then also sunflowers are another given for me as well.
Yep.
Okay, the next question is, we want to raise organic matter. They have no livestock, no fences. They will sell the feed. They want to terminate at freeze up. When do I seed and cut for feed? Will the regrowth be too much to seed into the spring?
Another awesome one. When I was going into university many years ago, the way that we were told that organic matter was built was we grow a crop, we take that above ground biomass and return it to the soil. And that's how we build soils. And I've listened to Jay talk, well, lots of times. He put a restraining order on me now, so I can't get as close to him anymore. But the thing that in Jay's presentations is I think it was 80% of the carbon from the above ground plant gets gassed off within 3 to 5 years, depending on tillage and all the other good stuff. So the way we have to build organic matter is through the liquid carbon pathway, and that's your root exudates. And this is where, when you're going to be taking a hay crop off, you will be exporting nutrients. That's a given. But what we're able to do is go into having a blend. And once again, depending on what your other goals are, other issues, soil issues. So we want to have a grass. That's where we get our tons. We want to have a legume, so that's going to be fixing some nitrogen. Have a broadleaf in there, and once again, so we have that triangle all figured out or filled out. But the key is, number one, is to have something that's going to regrow after cutting. And we want to have something like the Italian ryegrass that is going to stay vegetative and low underneath the canopy. So we're not going to get any dollars out of that, out of the hay. But what we're doing is we're going to have that plant that's in that vegetative stage that is going to, you know, when that plant has that nice big green leaf, it's capturing sunlight. As it's capturing sunlight, it's photosynthesizing. As it's photosynthesizing, it's creating sugar. The sugar can only get so high in that plant. So then once it hits that upper threshold, it just keeps on firing out these rudexitates into that soil. And so whether it's sugars, whether it's proteins, amino acids, oils, all of these good things. Jay, by the way, you just got unmuted. So anytime you want to jump in, go for it. So in this case, for a hay crop and building organic matter, keep that grass component high, have that annual and a biennial, have that legume to keep firing nitrogen into the system, and basically we want to cut it relatively early. And like say if you're using oats, I would cut it in that boot to early head stage. This way the energy might be down a little bit, but your relative feed quality is going to be decent. And then you're going to be opening up that fall growth, so you can have, you know, the oats will regrow, and you'll have, you know, that ground covered in green, pumping in those rudexitates into that soil.
And Kevin, this is Jay. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
All right. Well, first of all, I think you're doing an excellent job. And I think both your comments and Daryl's have been really spot on. The degraded soil that was just talked about, that's a real interesting one. You know, anytime we can bring livestock in, put that multi-species in and bring livestock in, that's when I've always monitored our largest gains in terms of soil aggregation, because, you know, you got to build these aggregates back, and in terms of carbon in the soil. And so if we can bring livestock in and do a graze on those multi-species covers, now you're really, that's a significant change. And then two, I think if you are haying it, it's real important to have a second phase of regrowth. And I think that's where you're talking about the Italian ryegrass. And the Italian ryegrass really comes to life in the fall. And livestock, usually, it's not unusual when we bring in livestock on our Italian ryegrass in the fall, put a multi-species mix in earlier, and then after we graze it, then later in the fall, the Italian ryegrass just comes to life. And that's where we see some of our better body condition scores, is when we're on the Italian ryegrass. Plus what you explained already, Kevin, is that's a fibrous root, so you're going to build aggregates. Yeah, you're all good principles, good solid principles.
And what Clayton Robbins talks about in his presentations is keeping that sugar to protein ratio at least 2 to 1. So the higher the sugars, and you know, he's even got up to 3 to 1. And when you get those sugars high enough, soluble carbohydrates, the rumen starts actually functioning properly. And you know, I joked with him. I said, so basically, you want your cows to be diabetic? And he said, yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And the only way you can get that is having that plant that's, you know, low growing, capturing photosynthesis, not growing real fast, but it's there. And that's where you said body scores, absolutely.
And I think too, in regards to, let's just take seeding rates, for instance, when you walk that field, you know, it's come up, you walk that field, you ask yourself, is there any sunlight that is not falling on a green plant? So if you've got sunlight hitting bare soil, you know, there's no point in that. So you always want to have you maximum use of sunlight. So you want every bit of sunlight falling on a green plant. If you don't have that, you're probably not seeded tight enough. And so it's just kind of a rule of thumb, you know, that we can all just realize when we walk those fields after they come up with. You know, they got to obviously got to grow a little bit, but that's all part of it, and it's a good measure.
Don't waste sunlight.
Exactly.
Okay, another question is there an ideal way to get rid of foxtail barley in heavy soils using cover crops?
Foxtail. It's a real interesting one because, 10 years ago, no one ever really saw any of it. And now it's everywhere and creating issues. Once again, going back to when weeds talk, when you see foxtail barley, that's telling me that number one, you have high nitrates in your soil, you have high sodium, and your available and we did this before I read the book. In 2011, we end up with, I think, 45 inches of rain. So it was a tad on the wet side, and we have some low land that water runs across in the spring. Well, it was July 10th, I think, is when it stopped running across that field. So, of course, foxtail barley started showing up. And Jay, cover your ears. We went in with a tandem disc. We disked it under because it was knee high. I don't know how many times we got stuck. And we went in with some sweeps, leveled it out a little bit, and then I seeded 8 pounds of radish. And that was the end of July is when we seeded. So, moisture was good, free available nutrients were there, and we had this carpet of foxtail that we worked in. And so the radishes grew, used all the water, opened up the soil, got the internal system working properly or better. And so, the foxtail, the next year was manageable. It, really a couple small patches. In 2016, I seeded that area plus an extra 50 acres down to a full season cover crop that we're going to hay and seed winter triticale into. Dad was cutting it, and he said, "Why is there no foxtail on field number 1 and field number 2, but field 3 there's patches of it?" And I said, "Well, field 1 and 2 is where I seeded the radishes." So when I told you, so this long-winded story is so that when foxtail grows, it tells me you have high nitrates, you have high sodium, and you have low calcium. So what the radishes did, and once again, this is when I'm just figuring out how these cover crops are working. And before I met Jay, so this, with the radish root, it's going to drill down, it's going to create a macropore. As it's drilling down, it's any of the brassicas are scavengers, so it's going to soak up any free nutrients that are in the soil. So it's going to soak up all that free nitrate, and it's going to create that macropore. So now we have a spot. Now the water's going to be able to infiltrate, and it can then take away some of that free sodium, or that built up sodium. When that radish rots, it releases a lot of that calcium, which on the exchange sites in the soil will then displace some of that sodium and flocculate that soil. It'll help fix that system. Saying that, in these foxtail spots, now what I know, would I just go with radishes? Absolutely not. I would throw in some sweet clover. Daryl, I'd put in a little bit of fall rye. Are you happy? Maybe some chicory. Once again, depending what your goals are, but have those deep tap roots, especially the annuals, because we want that root to grow. We want it to die, because when that root dies, then as it dies and it starts dehydrating, it shrinks down. Now we have a pore. If you have something like alfalfa will overwinter, it'll grow, it'll have that nice deep tap root, but that root won't die. So if it's not dying, it's not going to create a better spot for that water to go down, minus just on the periphery of that root surface. So foxtail, tie up the nitrate, bring up some calcium, and leach away that sodium. Those are the three keys.
So on another weed control issue, would tilling radish do the same to Canada thistle like you described to quackgrass? They're looking for ideas for a trial at a provincial park. So.
Okay. So I have an organic producer down south of us down at Granville. And one of the things I suggested to him is when he had a patch of Canadian thistle. Going back to when weeds talk, Canadian thistle is an indication that we have anaerobic soils. So how do we aerate these soils? Well, Jay would come out and tell you to go and get your deep ripper and work it up. Okay, maybe you wouldn't. But what I suggest in those areas, and once again, looking at an organic, because if you're in a provincial park, you probably don't want a lot of spray. So to go in and do some light tillage to knock back your thistles, then go in and once again use the tillage radish, maybe use some chicory, use some of these deep-rooted species, and you want to have species that are going to regrow. Because when we have this cover crop going into these thistle patches, what we want to do is anytime that you see a thistle push up above the canopy of your cover crop, you want to go in, mow it, or clip it. You want to force that thistle to regrow because it's going to weaken that root. Because you're going to have these radishes, and I've grown radishes in a tube, PVC tube, and the tube was 6 feet high. I filled it right full of soil, and I put 2 radish seeds on top on June 1st. On August 1st, I got a garden hose and I washed all that soil out of that tube. And then I measured how long that root was. And so in 60 days, that root went down 65 inches. So that root of those radishes will drill down through soil and get down to open up that soil. So once again, when that root dies, now you have a macropore. When you have a macropore, now that soil is going to be able to start breathing. So roots will fix these issues. And so when we know what weeds are growing, and that's the reason why When Weeds Talk is a really handy book, we get to identify what ecological advantage does that plant have over other ones. And once we can identify what their advantage is, let's take the advantage away. Because weeds are trying to fix the soil for us.
So there was just a comment for Brett who had a question about the JD 455. There's a person here who has an old JD 750, which is a similar metering system, and it did a good job of seeding mixes with large variance of seed size. That's good to know. So the next question is, we have been planting annual ryegrass with our barley silage crop with a legume in the mix. It's usually peas. But we have been disappointed with the regrowth the last few years. We're wondering if it's because we cut the silage too short. Do you recommend cutting it higher to encourage better regrowth?
Paul, are you on? Paul Kernuglian. He's the resident silage expert. Well, Kelly is trying to get him mobilized, if he's still there. And this is going to go back to what Jay talked about, is when you're looking, Paul is still here. So Aaron Kernuglian, if you can free up him, her. Basically, it goes back to the sunlight. So if you cut real short and you don't have enough leaf matter there, or that plant gets too far along in its maturity, your regrowth is going to be poor. And this is where, so if something gets, with fall rye, for instance, the whole key to terminate with a crimper is allowing it to get to flower. Once it gets past flowering, that plant is now progressed too far along in its life cycle to regrow. And this is where having the Italian ryegrasses in these mixes is really important, because now it opens up that window.
Kevin, I missed the species that they were cutting for silage that they were disappointed in. I just heard peas as one of them, but I missed the beginning of it.
So they do an annual ryegrass with a barley silage crop, and then the legume is usually peas.
Okay. Yeah, I would probably say timing of taking the silage probably plays a bigger factor into it than the stubble height. The earlier you take it, the better chance of regrowth, especially with optimum conditions, I guess. But yeah, in my experience, it's timing that plays the bigger role.
And barley doesn't regrow very well at the best of times. So using oats would regrow better. I love Japanese millet for regrowth.
Peas aren't all that hot of regrowing either, typically.
They had a follow-up question with, how do you deal with residue left on the soil in the spring? The air seeder they currently use cannot deal with much trash. Even their neighbor's disc drill had some trouble with the faba bean residue.
What is the issue with the residue?
They just can't deal with so much trash with what they have. So they're wondering, maybe how do you deal with the residue left on the soil in spring?
Is the disc drill, their neighbors have a press drill or an actual zero till? Because zero till should, especially if it was silage, should probably make it through, you'd think.
It was a press drill.
Oh, press drill. Okay. So
Yeah.
a press drill would be the issue. If you're using air seeder, if you went to a narrower opener, that will solve a lot of issues. My air seeder was a 8800 Bordeaux air seeder. And the 1 year I was using a 2-inch spoon seeding my winter wheat, and we got a bad batch and they wouldn't stay on the clips. So the only thing they had in was a hole opener. So I said, I don't care, I'm seeding, they'll do. Brought them home. I'll never go back. If I'm going into trash, I'll never go into anything else except for those hole openers. It's just a straight up and down opener instead of something pointing forward. I could go through a lot of garbage and it worked really well. So instead of using sweeps, going to something like a hole opener, that's a strategy I would use. A press drill is not meant to go into any trash. You get a lot of hairpinning and problems. Then you end up with a haircut like me.
Okay. Another question is, are pigs useful in cover crop rotations, or are they too destructive to be beneficial?
They're nature's double disc press, or a tandem disc, or a plow, depending on how much time you have out there. Once again, Nicole, she talks about, there's good tillage and bad tillage. So if you have the pigs out there and they're on a small area and they completely, they root down 12 inches, yeah, that's probably a little excessive. But to have pigs go through and pasture graze them, there's no issues with that. One of the stories I have on that is my brother-in-law. They made a pig tractor, so they're going to harvest their cover crops with that, because the pigs, perfect, they'll fertilize and they'll eat and everything's good. Well, he didn't realize that the pigs, when they're enclosed, will always put all their manure in one corner. So he had some issues of not very good distribution of his manure pack.
Okay. Is it possible to fix high anaerobic conditions due to wet conditions without doing till?
Absolutely. Get the roots down there. And it's when you say wet conditions, so like how wet are we? What kind of infiltration or saturation do we have in those soils? But basically, we want to get those roots in there, and those roots will fix a lot of the issues in agriculture today. The issue is if it's absolutely saturated, now we're going to have some other issues, but using some plants that will tolerate saturated soil conditions. Sugar beets would be one. We can get into some, whether it's grass, you get seeded down to grass. So a grass stand, and that's where, doing some seed production of some Timothy, or if you're closer to a place where there's lots of horses, get into some Timothy hay production, just to get that living root in there, use that water. And this is where using a penetrometer, or, getting a shovel and just digging, because there could be just a hard pan in there that we just haven't cracked. And so if you can get that cracked, now we're going to have some proper infiltration. And once again, Paul has some really good experience of reclaiming a couple of sloughs on his home quarter. And Paul, did you want to tell that story?
Yeah, I just wrote on the chat. After July long, you can broadcast tillage radish, and we broadcast right into the water, like try and get around the sloughs close enough that we can hit the water and far enough away we don't get stuck. But we were seeding between 180 to 210 acres 5 years ago on a section, to gaining back about 540 acres, doing nothing besides going around with a little broadcaster on the back of a side-by-side broadcasting, Japanese millet, sweet clover, tillage radish, those kinds of things, and getting those roots close to the sloughs and drying that stuff out. And the biggest problem you have is getting your side-by-side stuck. But
to give perspective, Paul is straight east of you. He's over in the Prince Albert area.
Yeah, we were to the point we were looking for more land. So, we were looking at paying anywhere from $21,000 to $3,000 an acre. And basically we've spent $2,000 a year on seed and reclaimed 200 acres back. So it worked out.
Okay, his question also followed up, is there a cover crop blend that will be effective after herbicide is applied to a cash crop?
Well, if the soil is that wet, to broadcast after is a definite opportunity. So if you already got the ruts in there, you might as well just go over top of them one more time, or use a plane. We've had decent success when there's moisture using aerial seeding. Really cost effective when you look at the cost of if you paid yourself to seed it versus get an aerial applicator in. But there are some opportunities. So if we're going to be seeding a cereal, to have some Italian ryegrass growing underneath that crop, you just use your regular herbicides, and the Italian ryegrass is okay. It's underneath. It's using the moisture. There's one of our people we work with in southern Manitoba. He grew oats, and I told him put down, at the time I told him, a pound of Italian ryegrass. And of course it was one of those wet years. I think it was 2017. And so he had a pound of Italian ryegrass under his oats. Wet fall, he went out, he sprayed the crop, didn't hurt the Italian ryegrass. Fall time came around, it was wet. He was out there combining. Neighbors would go in off their approach and they would sink to the axle because they didn't have anything underneath. Number one, using the moisture. Number two, those roots act like rebar. And so it gives that soil some integrity. So, and never mind the root exudates and the other good stuff. So yeah, there's some opportunities. It's just basically figuring out a system that's going to work for you.
Okay, can we seed a cover crop in an annual swath grazing crop that will regrow for spring grazing?
Absolutely. That's where, if with Imperial, when I decided to partner with them, Jim Campbell, the sales manager, he kept saying, okay, is there any way we can simplify this product list? And I said, well, no, not really. And the whole idea is because of these goals. So if we want to have something that overwinters, Kelly, can I get you to unmute Avery Shepherd? There's another guy with some awesome experience and local, and this is some of the things that he's doing. So we can throw in things like the Festioliums, some perennial ryegrass, sweet clover, red clover. There's a lot of these biennials that will, number one, will get some cut or some, cut and graze that first year, but they'll also overwinter and grow that next year.
Yeah, can you hear me over my kids screaming?
You betcha.
Right on. Yeah, I'm growing some overwintering species with my swath grazing mainly because I didn't like that 1 month window of nothing growing in May or early June. And it's worked fairly well. I started with light rates of Festiolium and everything looked good. The interesting thing was with just a pound of Festiolium, between that and my trial with no Festiolium, I had nothing but weeds where there was no Festiolium, and just with a few plants per square foot, I really reduced my weed pressure, which was quite surprising. And then I did get the bonus of the grazing. The one thing you do got to watch is your termination with that. This spring was my second year of Festiolium on the same field, and I went for 1 pound the first year. It terminated well, and then I put 4 pounds down the next year, which was good grazing. But I just had really marginal conditions when I was spraying it out this spring between wind and too wet and different things. So I had a lot of my Festiolium live through, and it didn't really hurt my crop, but I have a lot of grasses in that field now. So just something to watch. It all depends on your goals and where you're going with that sort of thing. But like Kevin said, the red clover and sweet clover, things like that are very good species too for that. It all comes down to your goals and what your second and third year is going to be on them fields, I think, to want to get into doing that stuff.
Okay. He also asked, is it possible to avoid compaction and thus tillage, breaking up the field again to seed following swath grazing crop?
Yeah, and this is where, having that living root is going to be part of the answer. Having this diversity is going to be the other thing, because once again, I'll stress this, when we start talking turnips and the brassicas, I don't like going over 1/2 pound in a blend. So if we're talking about 0.2 pounds of turnips, so that's going to be about 1 seed per square foot. That's going to be enough calcium in the tuber in the soil to then release that calcium to flocculate that soil and make things happen. So to have the deep roots, to have the good fibrous roots of your grass. And once again, the other challenge is, okay, so when it does get super wet, we're going to have to either have a place where we're going to really beat it up and have compaction issues, because the animals, when the soil's unfrozen and wet, then you put pressure on that wet soil, first thing that comes out is air. And so when the air comes out, now we've got anaerobic conditions and we have compaction. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It'd be really good to have a spot that is really sodded up, and when it gets wet, kick them out on that and then come back to it when it's not saturated.
Okay, the next question comes from east of Olds on Highway 21 area. For spring seeding a cover crop, how worried do you get about frost kill or poor germination from cold soils setting back the crop? They want to seed some as early as possible this coming spring.
Oh, okay. That's, in that situation, when we start talking about these functional plant groups, when you're going to be seeding as soon as you can, first thing in the spring, first thing you do is you get your black marker and you put a line through all of your warm season species. So you're kind of handcuffing yourself a little bit there, if that is the goal, to have a warm season species. On the flip side, we have a lot of awesome cool season species, annuals and biennials. We can still get a lot of diversity in there. And this diversity part, when we're talking about these functional plant groups, and if you were going to tell me you're going to grow barley, oats, wheat, and triticale, and that's going to give you lots of diversity, I'm going to say that's one functional plant group is what you're working with. You're dealing with a cool season annual. If you told me that you're going to have oats, barley, wheat, and winter triticale, now we're dealing with 2 functional plant groups, because now we have cool season annuals and a cool season biennial. So when we're dealing with super early seeding, now once again, depending on what our goals are, whether we're going to be grazing or going to be cutting, or is it just an annual or dealing with 2 years, we have lots of things to choose from. But we can still add in things like common vetch. We can put in some of the chicories and the plantains. We can still put in a lot of this diversity. So it's, once again, looking at that triangle, working on the functional plant groups and getting that diversity.
Kevin, if you don't mind me chiming in for a second.
Absolutely.
One thing you got to remember too is when you start adding diversity, things change in terms of tolerance, maturity, so many things change compared to a monoculture system.
Absolutely.
So I guess when you're, if you are putting some brassica in or some more sensitive, frost sensitive crops, and if you have oats and some barley in there, things like that can still survive with the diversity, different root systems and different habitat as well.
So I have a question. Last year I went and I seeded the pollinator mix, but what came up was mostly Canada Thistle. So would I expect still a benefit or like some Canada Thistle suppression, or if I was going to re-put in the pollinator blend, how would I deal with the Canada Thistle issue?
Okay, so once again, that tells me that you have some anaerobic conditions. So you have a hard pan underneath. So if there's a way to, if last year you were going to be clipping, if mowing that patch, because a lot of that pollinator mix will regrow and keep flowering. So by mowing it, once again, you're going to be weakening that root. When you weaken the roots, hopefully you get some shrinkage of that root, and so you're going to get better aeration in that soil. So then that thistle is now fixing the soil for you. So this coming year, if there's thistles coming, you're going to have to just whippersnapper and maybe just beat them up a little bit and just try to suppress that thistle, allow those roots to go down and do their thing.
So I've seen that no other questions have come in. If anybody has any more, oh, there we go. What type of covers would you recommend seeding into faba beans? The field does have a fair bit of potholes that I would like to see drained. The crop next year will probably be oats.
Okay, so now the question is, when do you want to terminate? Do you want it to terminate with the first frost at freeze up, or do you want to have it over winter? Having it over winter, is that a bad thing? And once again, going back to what Paul was talking about broadcasting into the sloughs, is that if we can have something established in the fall and overwintering in those low spots that hold water, and we have that living root, guess what? Those potholes are now going to start draining because we have that living root that's going to be creating these pores. So having something like chicory that first year is going to be low growing. It's going to be under the canopy. It's going to look like sow thistle, and that first year, that rosette, but it has this incredible root system, and so it'll go down and it'll open up that soil. Looking at that triangle, so you have a legume, throwing in the Italian ryegrass. Once again, it's a nice fit, because if the Italian ryegrass is boot high, and hopefully we don't have the issue like we did last year with the Harmony Italian ryegrass, that mix, apparently there's one species, when it gets really wet, it likes to skip the biennial part and go to annual. But the Malquatro, it stays vegetative all year from what I've seen. So putting that in, so it's only going to grow a couple inches high, maybe 6 inches. It's going to be above most of your cutting bar when you're cutting fabas, so that's not going to be an issue. Once again, it's going to use the water. That taproot going down with the chicory, it's going to open up that soil for you and create some drainage. So that's two. Yeah. When I saw your name, I said, "Oh, yeah, okay." You're the guy that told us about the Harmony Italian that went to seed the first year. So with this other variety without the blend, it's basically a non-issue. So grass, legume, and a broadleaf, nice little fit. And if you get the fabas off early enough, or get a plane, and you can then throw in some radishes, and about 2 weeks before harvest of your fabas, and just blow on 4 or 5 pounds of radish and maybe a pound of turnips, just to get more of those roots in the soil. A wise man once said that plants fix dirt, and Jay should be shaking his head right now. It's a great saying, because plants fix dirt.
Do you have any sage advice for people looking to do fix their gardens, I guess? Not everything's always going to be on a mass field scale. So how would we go about doing just some backyard gardening and amending our soils that way?
Avery, what did you do in your garden?
We had a lot of fun. One thing you can do is, I called it the sprinkle garden with my girls, is we took all our small seeded stuff and we made a patch. Instead of having 10 rows that are 50 feet long, I just made a 2-foot strip, and it was actually worked a bit, I guess. So I had bare soil, and we just put all those small seeded seeds in a container and sprinkled them out. So I had lettuce, radish, all sorts of funny things growing in there. And I never had a worm in there eat any of my lettuce or my radishes or anything like that. It was a pretty neat thing to see. And then I just had fun and mixed my big seeds as well. Used hay in between my rows, things like that. And the amount of weed suppression from that and the amount of worms you get moving in, it's pretty crazy. And you just got to kind of take a big breath sometimes and deal with some weeds and watch some cool things happen. Like, for instance, in my potatoes, I had one row that I never mulched with hay, and being a farmer, I got behind, and the chickweed got in the second row of potatoes, and they were just overrun with chickweed in the potatoes, and them were the nicest potatoes I ever had in my life. So I don't know what chickweed does to things. It must free up some calcium, but it did them potatoes a lot of good compared to the ones that were 2 feet over. So just have a lot of fun and experiment. Subterranean clover is a good thing to throw in there. Seems to take a bit of traffic. If the weeds get ahead, you can weed whack them, and then you get subterranean clover underneath, fixing nitrogen, breaking up compaction. So lots of cool things you can do, but mostly just have fun, take care of your garden, and experiment, learn lots.
And if we had another extra 2 hours, Jay could talk about his gardening experience too. So Jay, I don't know if you have the energy to talk about your panic garden or your gardening, but if you're ever down in the Bismarck area when the borders open, Menachem Farms, wonderful place to go and learn.
I'm real encouraged to hear people talk about the gardening part, because I think that's part of our equation here. But cover crops, I work with high tunnel and an outdoor garden, but the cover crops in the high tunnel are just a natural fit, because it allows you to restore carbon and restore soil aggregates after you have this hot, wet environment all summer in a high tunnel. And then I smother them in the spring. I put a fabric over them for 10 days. And that smothers out the cereal rye that was put in the fall before. And I have some annuals in the fall before also, but they don't overwinter. And so in the spring, I smother the cereal rye for 10 days, and then I plant into it. And makes very, very little weeding in that garden. Now, just another part that we can do.
Sounds amazing. Does anybody else have any further questions for everybody who's been a panelist? We've appreciated hearing from everybody.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'll still be here if there's more questions, but I want to thank everybody for attending and being involved. This is a great evening with great conversation.
Yes, I thank you so much for myself at Lara, and thank you for everybody for attending.